So my first question for you is, who are you? Where are you from? And may I ask how old you are?
My name is Bob Marsh. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm the president of Biocomp Research Institute. I'm 76 years old.
Awesome. So what's your background in health or engineering, and engineering, I should say?
Uh, I was in the Air Force from 1962 to 1966 and got my electrical training there. I was a bomb navigation mechanic on the B-47.
That's awesome.
When I got out of the service, I worked for RCA Computer Division in Van Nuys, California for 10 years or so, and then went on strike. And since I was out on strike, I looked for another job and found a job with Dr. Hershel at the Biocomp Research Institute in 1992.
Okay.
And I've been working in this company since then. In 93 or so, Hershel was looking around at, we were manufacturing the Biocomp 2010 back then, which had 17 different modalities that were computer configured in the unit itself. So it hooked up the computer. The computer would configure the 4 channels into each channel into any one of 17 different modalities.
Okay.
So that was our main product at the time. We started looking around at EEG people, and everybody that was at the head of EEG things, or manufacturing EEG equipment, had a methodology of using EEG that seemed to work. They all said they were different.
Mm-hmm.
They all seemed to have different places they looked at, alignments that they met, times that they exercised, etc., etc. Hershel looked at all that and said there must be something more common to the people than the fact that EEG is working.
Mm-hmm.
And his assumption was that the blood flow is being changed.
Okay.
And so by doing theta beta work, you could actually modify the blood flow. And so he decided that he was going to have SPEC scans done on people while they were doing EEG work to see if, in fact, blood flow was what was happening. The medical people decided that that wasn't a reasonable use of SPEC scans, in that fact that they had to put the dye in and take the scan and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so Hershel ran across this professor in Pennsylvania, and who was looking at using spectroscopy on animals. They were open skull, looking at the brain blood flow using spectroscopy. That's using NIR.
Wow.
HEG basically is what spectroscopy.
Right.
Versatile. So spectroscopy is the basis for HEG.
Right.
He wondered if it could be used post-closed skull, and so he and I designed this unit that would shine red and infrared LED light through the skull, bounce them off the brain, and come back to the center, and give a reading indicating the oxygenation of the blood behind the skull.
Wow.
And so that's been the product line for the last 20 years or so.
Sure. So was 1992, is that your first exposure to biofeedback?
Yeah, it was. I'd never done that before.
Sure.
In fact, I was doing the engineering on the systems and took a biofeedback training course from his wife, Marjorie Timmer.
Mm-hmm.
And she was rather famous in the field, and she was giving classes, and I sat in and went through a whole series of classes for, it must have been 5 or 6 months.
Wow.
And learned my biofeedback there, but I had brought the engineering with me.
Sure. Well, they'd been involved in it since like the 70s, right?
Yeah, they started they started grouping up around 1972. They
Okay.
were doing alpha training. Alpha training was a big thing for about 5 years, and then it got a bad reputation.
Mhm.
And alpha training was tied to biofeedback, and so biofeedback got a bad reputation. So they've been trying to live down that reputation probably for the last, whatever it is, 30, 40-something years, 41 years.
Mhm.
Uh, that alpha training had people were using it to try to get in hypnotic states and made all kinds of weird claims
Right.
that kind of made it go bad on them.
Right. Well, and we still see that today. I mean, there's a lot of people they'll just say anything, really. So then why do you keep working with this technology?
Well, for one, it's a job,
Sure.
and for two, I see a lot of good results coming back from the field.
Sure.
I've heard of things that are really mind-blowing in the fact of how they've changed people's lives,
Right.
how the people have handled the symptomology of dyslexia.
Mhm.
There was a gal that had dyslexia. Their folks bought a unit, and she trained with it, and she graduated from university on the dean's list.
Wow.
She was not having any success at school up to that time at all. So,
Sure.
it's stories like that make me stay in the field.
That's awesome. So then, I mean, you and Herschel founded this pretty much. So
Yeah, we founded HEG.
yeah,
Nobody was doing this before we did.
that's incredible. So I guess from what I've gathered is essentially your blood flow in your neocortex it's asynchronous, right, to the different parts of your brain.
Yeah, it turns out that there's a finite amount of blood that goes around in your brain.
Uh-huh.
You actually move it from place to place as you decide what you're going to be doing.
Right.
You move it to the bicycle riding places when you want to ride a bike. You move it to the talking places when you want to talk.
Sure.
You move it around, and you can actually follow it moving around with SPECT scans.
Right. Right.
So that was another basis of us being able to do ECG, the fact that you could voluntarily cause somebody to move blood into an area that they weren't moving blood into before,
Right.
just by making that area activating by exercising and showing them the results of the exercise being that the oxygenation went up.
Right.
And the oxygenation goes up because when you use an area, the cells generate the carbon dioxide,
Right.
which opens up the vascular system into that area to bring more new blood into that area. So when you do ECG, what happens is when you first put it on, you reach a point where you go down for a little while because you're using up the oxygen that's there.
Right.
And then you can make it go up relatively easily once you've determined the right exercise to make that area active.
Right.
Blood flow changes are relatively slow. It's like a temperature change on the finger.
Mm-hmm.
It takes 3 to 5 seconds for the intention to actually make the blood flow change.
Okay.
So it's a slow moving process. It's not a fast change like EEG would be. So you don't need anything like the speed of EEG equipment to be able to do HEG.
Right.
There are, in fact, 2 ways HEG is done now. One is the near-infrared spectroscopy version,
Right.
and one is the looking at the infrared coming out of the forehead, which is actually temperature.
Right. Your skin
So
temperature
it's a
response.
temperature monitoring version.
Sure.
And so the HEG was developed by Hershel and myself, and the temperature one has been developed by Jeff Carmen in New York.
Right. Have you? One of the things I've been reading about lately is migraine research. Have you heard much about that in relation to the brain blood flow?
Yeah, Jeff Carmen is he has been treating migraines for years and years and years, and that's why he wanted to do the temperature one.
Mm-hmm.
His unit looks at an area, a circle that's about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter.
Mm-hmm.
So he's looking at more of the prefrontal cortex at one time than the Hershel Tuman version does. Ours looks at an area that's about as big as the end of your thumb and about as deep as your thumb up to the first knuckle. Jeff Carmen has been working with migraineurs for probably 15, 20 years, and he says within 6 to 10 sessions he can stop the migraines. The people can train to stop the migraine,
right?
And then not have them at all, or if they start having them by doing some retraining once or twice at a time, they can make them stop again. So yes, it's very effective for migraine.
That's amazing. Yeah, well, because what I've been reading lately is essentially a lot of the physical symptoms of migraines are essentially the same as like hypoxia, and like people's brains start swelling up and everything. Like it's almost like altitude sickness. So it makes sense.
Yeah, there's been a couple things going on with migraines. It used to be thought that it was a change of the vascular system tightening up, and then that in itself would trigger the nerves that tie to the vascular system, since there aren't any nerves in the brain itself.
Right.
That theory, the last time I heard, has kind of gone by the side, and it seems that there's something in the basal ganglia that triggers migraines.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where the science is nowadays.
Sure. So is there anything, I mean, we've covered a lot of really cool stuff already, but is there anything that comes up in your mind about the HEG that you've noticed or you want to share?
It's an effective way to train the prefrontal cortex to gain better control of the brain.
Right.
The areas that the prefrontal cortex has control over directly things like attention deficit, anxiety, depression, short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that the prefrontal cortex has pathways to every other part of the brain.
Right.
So it's the major controller of what goes on in the rest of the brain, whether or not the rest of the brain gets activated,
mm-hmm.
as in fight-flight, or whether it gets moderated. For instance, anxiety tends to be the fact that an anxious moment may happen,
mm-hmm.
and that moment gets sent to the part of the brain worried about anxiety, that the prefrontal cortex doesn't have enough strength to douse that feeling,
mm-hmm.
that sensor. So the next time anxiety comes in, it builds. And so an anxious person tends to have multiple anxiety things happening without any of them getting doused by the prefrontal cortex. So by making the prefrontal cortex stronger, it douses each one as it comes in.
Right. Yeah, it's incredible. So, okay, well, so like back when you got introduced to this and working with Hershel, like how skeptical were you about the idea that we actually had like control over the blood flow in our brain?
That was one of the main things that Hershel wanted to make sure of.
Right.
So what he did is he used all the people that came to Marjorie's classes in biofeedback, ran HEG on them, and on some were able to get SPECT scans after doing the HEG,
mm-hmm.
and saw that the area behind the forehead had become very oxygenated.
Sure.
And in fact, the oxygenation stayed longer than just after the session. It might have lasted a day or two at a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
So the people were able to bring the oxygenation into that area and be able to replicate it, even though they weren't doing the actual physical training.
Okay, that's amazing. Well, and I've noticed just from using the HEG that I mean the effect it's very unique and it's definitely dependent on like where you put the sensor on your head. Which I mean, just learning that was such a mind blow for me.
Yeah, depends on whether you do it on the left or the right, it'll affect one thing or another.
Say that again.
If you even higher on the left or higher on the right than you did before, it'll change a different position.
Sure. Yeah.
Will give you a different feeling. So Hershel was doing at one time a lot of research looking at what parts of the prefrontal cortex were hooked to what other parts of the brain.
Right.
And so that you could kind of forecast where to do it for whatever the problem was.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how true that really turned out to be.
Sure.
But I do know that it's true that different parts of the prefrontal cortex do affect how different parts of the brain get affected.
Right. Well, and yeah, I mean, it's like our brains we have these like specific regions for doing things, but then they're also like generalized, and so it's hard to tell what's actually going on in there. And
everybody's brain is unique.
Right.
There are left brain people and right brain people. There are people with reverse brains that react opposite from what you would expect.
Right.
Hershel, at one time, we did a 2-sensor unit where we looked at both the right and the left at the same time and got some unique results out of that. Sometimes it showed that the oxygenation moves from the left to the right when you're training the right and back when you're training the left. Sometimes both of them increased.
Okay.
So it was unknown what was really happening, I think. And I'm not sure what Peter's going to find when he does his thing.
Right. So have you guys done like memory studies, or have you guys just, paid attention to any of that coming out with the HEG?
Basically in the clinic, what we prefer to do is do a pre and a post brain capabilities test, something like Web Neuro or CNS has one now, CBS has one now. It's kind of a battery of tests. There's an outfit called Roberto that has one. It's a series of tests that are typically brain exercises like spatial recognition, reverse number subtractions, like subtracting 7 from 102 or something.
Sure.
1,002, and keep going backwards. There are finger tapping tests. There are tests that show you a color with a name, and you have to use the name instead of the color that's there. And, there's all kinds of tests that check out the brain. If you run those tests and then run 10 sessions of HEG and then run the test again, you'll find improvement in almost all areas of those tests.
That's incredible. It's our brain is like really a muscle in some ways. It's pretty.
Very, very similar. It's like a muscle in the fact that if you overtrain it, you lose the capability of its inhibiting things. You lose the total capability. It's like going to the gym and overexercising, and you lose fine motor control. Like overnight it'll resolve, but the same thing kind of happens in the brain.
Sure.
You might get an abreaction from overtraining HEG, but usually it'll resolve overnight, and it's just a minor. Excuse me. A minor loss of regulation.
Sure. Yeah, I've done that before, where I kept the sensor on my head for quite a while and doing the breathing exercises, and then I just felt like a point where I was like, it's like extra sensitive almost in my head, and then I had to train it down almost, because it lasted for a good half a day, and then it went away.
And that probably would have resolved overnight.
Yeah, it was gone.
You would have been felt different in the morning. Some people feel pressure in their head after they do it. Some call that pressure headache. I'm not sure it really is.
It's a different
headache.
feeling.
I think you're just feeling the pressure of the change of that capability of that part of the head.
Right.
So that's one of the other things trainers have to watch out for. Two things to watch out for is the fact that they're not overtraining,
Right.
and they can do that by monitoring the graph, which tends to drop off drastically when the overtraining starts to become apparent.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is monitoring the client's feeling about what's going on in their head.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. That was a great overview. I'm trying to think of what else. So, okay, well, here's one more question. What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Coming to work. I really enjoy the work.
That's great. I'm sure you've gotten to interact with,
So,
no worries.
okay.
I just say I'm sure you've gotten to interact with a lot of very unique people over the years, and it's really neat to sort of be in a new sort of a new territory for science.
Yeah, it's not that new, and yet it's not that accepted. I don't know why, because all the results tend to be positive.
Right.
There aren't people that are sent to hospitals because of doing biofeedback,
Right.
or neurofeedback, like there are people on drugs.
Right.
People aren't killed by it. People's symptomology change permanently via biofeedback as opposed to temporary symptom reduction with drugs.
Right. Well,
For
potentially worse
instance, on a
relapse.
attention deficit, those drugs actually cause chromosomal changes in people,
Right.
which is a pretty nasty thing to have happen to you.
What kind of changes?
Chromosomal changes.
Chromosomal
Chromosomes
changes.
change.
Sure.
DNA. Yeah.
Sure.
People, it's easier for a doctor to prescribe a drug, which takes them maybe 5 seconds to write a script,
Right.
than to recommend that or even to put biofeedback into their office situations.
Right. Or
But
even just to talk to their clients, actually figure out what's going on first.
the clients that come to biofeedback tend to be the ones that have bad reactions from medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Or people that have looked at some of the literature and said, "Oh, that's neat." Or even some of the people I talk to when I'm flying on an airplane, or just out in the world, they say, "What do you do?"
Sure.
And I give them the spiel, and they say, "Oh, that's interesting. I have friends that thought they could use that kind of thing,"
Mm-hmm.
and so sometimes something happens out of that. But it's pretty effective to tell them that they can actually have control of fixing their own symptomology without using drugs and the fact that they do in fact have that control.
Right.
That's the hard thing to convince most people of, is that they have that control.
Right.
HEG is good at that because you can show them what's happening right there on the screen while you're showing in the session.
Right.
Another good way to convince people that they have control is to do finger temperature modification with them,
Mm-hmm.
because they can see that they can make the finger get hotter and colder.
Right. That's cool. I'm taking notes here. Okay, so does anything else come to mind you'd like to share? We're at about 24 minutes.
I think I've pretty well covered everything.
Yeah, that was great. Very succinct, which I really appreciate.
Okay, glad to do it for you, Josh.